Okay. We didn't talk about the measurement of arterial pressure, and arterial pressure is probably the most important vascular pressure for us to have because it is the determinant of organ perfusion. The important concept is that there is no one arterial pressure. The arterial pressure wave, as you can see in this diagram, if you looked at the arterial pressure in millimeters of mercury from the ascending aorta down to the saphenous vein, as the pulse of pressure and flow go down peripherally, the capacitance of the vasculature widens out the flow characteristic, but because of the elastic nature of the vasculature, your pulse pressure actually increases, such that if I measured a radial arterial pulse pressure, I would see that it would be significantly higher than that measured at the aorta. Importantly, however, you can do that, the mean arterial pressure of the large vasculature remains absolutely constant, which means two things. First of all, under normal conditions, I can measure arterial pressure in the radial artery, and number two, that there is no such thing as arterial resistance. If there was arterial resistance, the pressure would drop, and it doesn't. So the large arteries are essentially capacitors for flow, and the resistance occurs downstream, which gets on to the primary question, the thing I'm going to talk about, which is vascular resistance. The problem with vascular resistance is that we assume, by Ohm's law, that there is a constant pressure drop from the circuit, from the aorta to the vena cava, and that we assume a constant flow, and we look at the pressure-flow relationship, and we assume that, in fact, the slope of this line is resistance. This is in no way reality. If one were to look at the arterial pressure going from the aorta through to the veins, down into the venules, and then the capillaries, you can see that most of the pressure drop is occurring in the arterioles and the precapillary sphincters. Thus, if you were to look at where the resistance exists, it would be totally concentrating in the arterioles, and thus the concept of systemic vascular resistance is a meaningless concept. It doesn't exist in real life. What we want to know is the arterial resistance or vasomotor tone, and that will be the major determinant of the sympathetic tone. Arterial resistance is not uniform clearly across the vasculature. Well, we can actually measure this, and what we did in a recent publication is we actually measured real aortic flow with a flow probe on the aorta of human beings, and we put a finger on the inferior vena cava, and we caused the arterial pressure and flow to fall, and we could look at the relationship between stroke volume and pulse pressure in human beings. This is the only study that's ever done that, and it was a royal pain to do, but it took us about 3 years to finish. But as you can see, as you decrease flow, you get a decrease in pressure. And in fact, the relationship in human beings between pressure and flow does something very interesting. Not only is it linear, you will notice that the pressure, when it extrapolates down to zero, is not going to zero. It's actually going to a pressure which is higher than right atrial pressure, and that is the pressure at zero flow. And this is the essence of the concept. Your arterial tone behaves as if the back pressure in you and I is somewhere around 30 to 40 millimeters of mercury. During general anesthesia, it falls to about 15 to 20. But the point of the matter is that the slope of this line, the change in pressure to change in flow, is your arterial tone. If you were to draw the line through zero, or CVP, you would see a lesser slope, or actually a higher resistance, because this is the reciprocal of the resistance. And you would calculate that if you merely increase cardiac output across a normal tone vasculature, your calculated systemic vascular resistance would fall. But your arterial tone had not changed at all. The way in which we can look at that was described by Andy Rhodes earlier, and that is that you can look at the arterial resistance as being a decrease in the slope of this line, whereas an increase in resistance would look like that. One can look at it more appropriately, and I believe Jean-Louis Touboul will discuss the concept of arterial elastance, which is, in my opinion, the more appropriate way of looking at arterial tone at the bedside, but that's another story. So on the regulation of flow, the primary mechanism by which the organs of the body increase their tissue perfusion is by causing that tissue itself, the brain, the kidney, the muscle, to locally vasodilate. based on its metabolic demand. And what happens is there is a passive increase in flow because there's a high upstream pressure. I decrease the resistance and I increase the flow. Accordingly, cardiac output within this context is only important in order to maintain an arterial pressure adequate enough to maintain autoregulation of blood flow. Regrettably, what happens is when cardiac output falls, baroreceptors increase mean arterial pressure by maintain mean arterial pressure by increasing vasomotor tone to maintain perfusion of the heart and the brain at the expense of the rest of the body. And thus, knowing that the blood pressure is normal in no way tells you that in fact you're adequately perfusing your tissues. You can say you're adequately perfusing your brain and your heart, but that's about all. And although Woody Allen said that the brain was his second most favorite organ, the fact of the matter is that you can't stay alive very long if you're not perfusing your gut, your liver, and your kidneys. And thus, the problem is going to be for us in this conversation is to how do we marry mean arterial pressure, arterial tone, and cardiac output in the assessment of cardiovascular status. And I wanted to bring that up now. Thank you.